In 1969, the term ageism was coined by Robert Neal Butler, who later went on to become the first director for the National Institute on Aging. The term ageism is broken into three parts: the prejudicial attitudes towards the elderly in the aging process, the discriminatory practice and actions of people against the elderly, and the policy designed by the government to perpetuate stereotypes and harm the well-being of the elderly. In today's society, it's important to note that when a person is approached with ideas that are racist or sexist, they're generally looked at as such. However, with ageist ideas, those are not so easily recognized. Ideas such as, old people are bad at driving, or doctors are less likely to give you the same quality of care as they would if you were younger. Typically, when presented with the idea that the elderly are being discriminated against by society, by systemic causes, they're not so receptive. Stereotypes against the elderly include asexual behavior, inability to learn, and that they typically live in poverty or live alone. In the study from 1999 by Paul Moore, ageism is looked at as a discriminatory field that affects everyone. It's unique in that way. If you live long enough, you will be the target of ageism towards the elderly, and if you are young, you experience the ageism towards the youth. TV and movies do very little to dispel these stereotypes, and if anything, they reinforce them to mass audiences. When you see grandparents in film or on TV, they fall into very few categories. The grandmother, more specifically, is usually doting and very kind, someone who is warm and ready with an embrace, and grandfathers tend to be portrayed as bumbling or tinkerers or just generally buffoons, though they display some sort of wisdom of age in the critical moments in the characters' lives. These are the stereotypes we perpetuate through what we consume. We portray the elderly as isolated or lacking in social connections, perhaps even, desiring to be alone. Rates of poverty amongst the elderly have more to do with how that person's life has been rather than the fact that they are retired or no longer working. According to the same Paul Moore study, most elderly persons who are alone or in poverty have been that way for most of their life, or their families have rejected, maybe even abandoned them. As we grow up, we're exposed to all sorts of mindsets, be it the racist and sexist ideas that flow around us that we may not see because of where we are in life. But ageism permeates every level of society. As children, we get told jokes, and as teenagers, we tell jokes about doddering old people and their inability to perform tasks in society properly. This sort of stereotype has been combated at the federal level with legislation designed to prevent discrimination for hires based on age, and at one point that law set the mandatory retirement age to 70 from 65, and then a few years later that part was removed, but the discriminatory hiring practices went away. A study done in the year 2000 by Melinda Kennedy and Robert Montvillo indicated children who were exposed to their older generation peers, their grandparents and other elderly people on more constant, more frequent bases were more likely to have better attitudes as they grew up than those who had lesser contact with elderly persons. This exposure and immersion into what it means to be around an older person is an excellent method of teaching from a young age that all people should be respected, the elderly no exception. However, it's not just the youth who are at risk of perpetrating ageist stereotypes. Many old people now were raised with stereotypes about the elderly, which they still carry, and it turns them into a sort of self-loathing group where they no longer identify with their peers as elderly. They see their friends and those who are near to them as elderly, but they refuse to see themselves that way. They don't want to be portrayed as weak or incapable. This is sort of neurotic denial, and it allows them to protect themselves against their own beliefs. It's cognitive dissonance at its finest. This could be something as simple as saying, well, I haven't had a wreck in 5 years, I'm still good at driving. Old people are bad at driving, therefore I must not be old if I'm good at driving. And this sort of self-destructive behavior isn't healthy. It's not something that's sustainable, and it's something that should be looked at and addressed, and we should find ways to make being old something worthwhile, not something to be feared. Within other social contexts, ageism is highly prevalent, the medical field especially. Ageism on both ends of the spectrum is something that has to be worked on. A lot of physicians don't give the same level of care to their elderly patients as they do their younger ones, as private insurance is more willing to pay higher amounts for the same surgeries, whereas government-funded healthcare options such as Medicare don't offer the same level of payment. A lot of times physicians will also decline certain surgeries that may prolong an elderly person's life because they will believe that they're not equipped or capable of recovering in the same kind of way that a young person is. In addition to spending less time with their clients and patients, psychologists and physicians also overinflate exactly how many and what type and how often certain disorders happen to the elderly community. And this causes, the root of ageism comes from gerontophobia, the fear of the elderly or the fear of the aging process. When someone believes that being old means being run down, being lonely, and losing one's mind, it's a scary thought to think about growing up and aging and becoming old. That has to change. Advertising these days is very heavily reliant upon using the ideas of youth and telling people that old is ugly. Advertisements for wrinkle remover, facelifts, Botox, vibrant young people on a beach. These are all images that we are flooded with every day, and they tell the elderly among us now that they're not wanted by society, and they tell the young among us that they should never be okay with getting old. It's a systemic issue that needs to be tackled and addressed, but as long as those advertisements work and sell products, companies aren't going to change unless society demands such change. Gerontophobia can also have a connection to people's fear of death, to worry about immortality. This fear of death that's experienced by most all people is not without precedent. As far as we know, everyone before us has died, but there is a growing number of people in the aging research community who've started believing and treating aging as a disease rather than an inevitable process. One such person is David Sinclair. He's the co-director of a lab on aging at Harvard, and he was quoted as saying, "The first person to live to 150 has already been born." And he's right in saying that it's not crazy anymore. we're getting to the point where our science, technology, in conjunction with our eating habits, our practices of mindfulness and meditation, and other activities to keep the body and the muscles loose and limber, are working together to sort of build this better future. The idea that somebody who is 20 or even 30 right now in their 60s and 70s could be considered, middle adulthood, middle-aged, truly middle-aged, in what could be seen as a weird touch of irony. Holding ageist views may actually make this happen to people with higher rates. A self-fulfilling prophecy, if you will. If you believe that growing old means becoming impotent and performing sexual acts poorly, well, then you're going to give yourself an anxiety issue over wondering when that's going to happen. And anxiety completely conflicts with sexual performance. So then you have performance issues, and you expected performance issues from aging. So you must be old now, and you're on the doorstep of your fears. Approaching those stereotypes and those fears in a more wholesome, constructive manner, one may realize that it could be a change in blood pressure. It could be something as simple as just stress that day. It could lead someone to check to see if there are other options, or just a talk therapy session. Something rather than just giving up on their sexual life because they feel that they're too old for it. Too old for something is a very constructed phrase. But society has started becoming more aware of what ageism is. As of today, right now, as I talk, we're not equipped to solve ageism. But we are in a place where we can start talking about the underlying issues of ageism. We can start talking about the fear of growing old. And once we can tackle that, and once we are past that, then and only then can we start actually looking at how to get rid of the discrimination. It's going to be a conversation that's not going to be fun. It's going to be a conversation that is full of fear. But as we have this conversation, we should look at those around us, the elderly, and see what stereotypes we hold to ourselves right now. What is it that you see as negative in the old person across the room? What about them makes you say, oh, they must not be good at driving. Oh, I bet they can't even hear me. Other stereotypes like that, hurtful words. How do we look past those? And when you find them in yourself, are you willing to confront them? Anyway, I'd like to thank you for watching, and if you have any comments, please leave them below. I'd love to have some discussion on this. Thanks.